This book promises to teach you secret behavior reading techniques taught to intelligence agencies. It claims to contain the most powerful people reading system in the world. But is this actually true? Let's find out. Chapter 1 talks about skills and techniques. It states that there are three things almost all of our failures can be traced back to: our observations, our behaviors, and our communication. It talks about mastery and the four different levels of it. It mentions the Dunning-Kruger effect and has a quote I find interesting: knowing is the enemy of learning. It talks about knowledge versus skills and how many people get addicted to learning information, but ultimately obtaining skills and practicing is what is going to get you results. It also mentions a popular study by Albert Mehrabian, which claims that 93% of interpersonal communication is nonverbal, and the book explains why this is incorrect. The book instead suggests that around 66% of communication between humans is nonverbal. This chapter then explains the three fundamental parts of the human brain: the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, and the neocortex. It then discusses social media and debunks the common myth that our attention spans are getting shorter. Chase explains that what is really happening is that our brains are getting better at quickly identifying when something is important or interesting to us. Next, this chapter states that in many social situations, someone doesn't discover until the end of the interaction that the other person has objections. Chase says that the 6-minute X-ray system solves this issue by helping you spot these objections as they happen in real time. Finally, there's a summary which says that the laws of human behavior are always running in the background and therefore matter a lot more than most people realize. Chapter 2. This chapter starts by stating that there's a massive difference between research-based and results-based techniques. It explains the 4 laws of human existence and the impacts that keeping these laws in mind has on your perception of the world. It then lists the 4 different lenses of seeing people and mentions that once you start seeing behind someone's mask, judgment disappears because you see people as reasons. The chapter ends with a quick summary. Chapter 3. This chapter begins by talking about the one error that body language articles online make. It's called the attribution error. This is when you assume that a single gesture has a singular meaning. The truth is that when it comes to reading behavior, context is key. After that, it talks about something Chase Hughes came up with: the behavior table of elements. This is a really smart tool, and the book explains how to read it and how to use it to spot the likelihood of deception. Chapter 4. This chapter talks all about the eyes. It makes the claim that if you were to only study the eyes, you'd still be privy to more information than anyone else in the room. The reason for this is because the eyes are difficult to consciously control. There's a term called gestural hemispheric tendency, which just means which side of the body a person gestures when accessing positive and negative information. It mentions many other eye behaviors such as eye home, which is where someone looks to access memories, shutter speed, which is how rapidly the eyes blink, pupil dilation, confirmation glances, and the eyebrow flash. It also gives some examples of how and when these behaviors might show up in a conversation. The chapter ends with a summary and emphasizes the importance of not just spotting these behaviors, but spotting the causes of these behaviors. Chapter 5. This chapter discusses various facial expressions like lip compression and what they mean, and also how to spot false facial expressions. It states that ingenuine facial expressions will typically suddenly stop, whereas genuine expressions tend to fade away. False facial expressions are also often asymmetrical, whereas genuine expressions are almost always symmetrical, with the exception of the facial expression of contempt. The chapter ends with a summary and knowledge check. Chapter 6. This chapter starts by talking about another misinterpreted behavior: crossed arms. Chase says this behavior can usually be ignored, with 2 exceptions. Next, it explains different behaviors like digital extension, /flexion, breathing location, and fidgeting. It gives scenarios for when one might see these various behaviors, and the chapter once again ends with a summary. Chapter 7. This chapter might be the most interesting one, as it's all about deception. It immediately starts by stating we aren't looking for lies, but actually stress, discomfort, and uncertainty. It makes it clear that no human or machine can detect lies, not even the polygraph. This chapter lists virtually all of the important stress indicators such as hesitancy, psychological distancing, rising pitch, non-answers, resume statements, non-contractions, throat clasping, ambiguity, over apologies, and more. There are also several scenarios given for many of these behaviors. At the end of the chapter, there's a summary where Chase again states that there aren't any deception behaviors, only stress behaviors. Chapter 8. This chapter talks about how to obtain information from someone without asking many questions. It mentions how whenever we share sensitive information with someone, we feel a deeper connection with that person. It talks about how and why elicitation works and something called the hourglass method and the two psychological principles it relies on. However, it explains that the hourglass method should only be used when you need to obtain vital and sensitive information. It discusses the factors that make elicitation possible, such as the fact that people feel the need to, quote, correct the record when they hear inaccurate information, or how most people will go to great lengths to convince you of something if you don't believe them. It then talks about 10 different conversational techniques like flattery and provocative statements, which is any statement that provokes a response, and it gives an example for each one of the techniques. At the end of the chapter, it says that even though this method may seem simple, it can be very powerful. It also has a knowledge check at the very end of the chapter. Chapter 9. Chapter 9 talks about something called the Human Needs Map, which is a tool used to identify someone's social needs. There are 6 needs, 3 primary needs and 3 secondary needs. This chapter discusses each need in detail and the behavioral and outward indicators that a person has this need. It says how to identify someone's needs and gives examples of how someone with each human need might speak. It talks about how the human needs secretly reveal fears and claims that this is the biggest thing one can use to persuade and influence a person's decisions. It then gives 2 examples of how knowing someone's social needs can be useful. It talks about chemicals and neuropeptides specifically, which are made inside the brain, and how when someone's human needs are met, their body is flooded with this chemical. The book then makes it clear that the human needs map doesn't represent all human needs, just the social needs someone is expressing, which can help you effectively persuade and communicate. Finally, this chapter covers something called locus of control, which is essentially whether someone tends to blame other people/circumstances for what happens in their lives, or if they view themselves as being in charge of their own fate. And once again, there is a knowledge check at the very end. Chapter 10. This chapter talks about another tool called the decision map and the 6 pillars associated with it. Each pillar is essentially a reason why someone might make a decision. It gives a scenario of buying a cell phone case and how someone with each pillar would think when deciding what phone case to buy. It then lists 4 examples of situations when it would be useful to know how someone you're interacting with makes decisions. At the end of the chapter, there's a quick summary which explains that the decision map paired with the human needs map is what really allows you to deeply see into someone's psychology. Chapter 11. This chapter covers a technique called sensory preference identification. This technique is derived from a man named Walter Burke Barb, who identified the 3 ways human beings learned best: visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. The book lists a bunch of words that visual, auditory, and kinesthetic people are likely to use. It then states that a behavior analyst's job is to find which sensory preference a person has and then adapt their language to communicate more effectively. It gives examples of when knowing a person's sensory preference could be useful and says this technique is the key to, quote, hearing between the lines. Chapter 12. Chapter 12 talks about pronoun usage. It lists 3 types: self, team, and others. It notes that others pronoun users are the least common, making up roughly 20% of people. It gives 2 examples of each pronoun using type of person. It gives 2 real world examples in sales and business and makes the point that knowing which pronouns someone uses can help you persuade and communicate better with them because it helps you know which words to use when speaking to them. It has a quick knowledge checkpoint towards the end, and then the summary mentions that when speaking to a large group of people, it's best to use all 3 types of pronouns: self, team, and others. This way you can communicate more effectively to everyone in the crowd. Chapter 13. This chapter talks about paying attention to the use of adjectives. It says to simply imagine the adjectives you hear from someone going into a 2-column list, negative and positive. It gives an example of someone describing why they left their previous job and highlights the use of adjectives, pronouns, and sensory words. It claims that there is tons of data in the way someone speaks and that using sensory preference and pronoun identification, as well as by paying attention to which adjectives are used, you can truly hear between the lines. It also mentions that often in interrogations, the interrogator will use different pronouns, sensory words, and adjectives than the subject, and often right before a confession, the interrogator will accidentally change their language to match how the subject speaks. Chapter 14. This chapter is the shortest, only 4 pages long. It talks about a principle which states that people who follow physically in a conversation are more likely to follow psychologically as well. It says that when a person is talking about something they are passionate about, they are vulnerable and therefore more likely to be compliant. It talks about how not only does body language reflect what's going on in someone's mind, but physical movements also change one's psychology. For example, it's easier to feel confident if you're sitting up straight versus slouching. Chapter 15. Chapter 15 discusses the tool that allows you to take the most essential behavior reading techniques and easily apply them during conversations. All the quadrant is a plus sign with 4 different elements. The profiler should make initial observations of the person they're speaking to, observe changes in behavior, make notes of the changes using an arrow or abbreviation, and circle the observations they were able to identify the cause of. Then there is a list of all the quadrant elements, as well as the annotations for each one. Chapter 16. This chapter introduces the behavior compass, the actual tool one would use to profile someone in 6 minutes. The behavior compass is a combination of the quadrant and each behavior technique in the book and their abbreviations. This chapter also includes the fears associated with the human needs map and states at the end that while this quadrant should be able to be filled out within 6 minutes, initially it may take up to 15 minutes to fill out. Chapter 17. This chapter gives 2 scenarios, one where you're working in sales and one where you are a therapist. It lists all of the information you may have gained about each person and asks a bunch of questions about how you would converse with them to get the best results. At the end, it states that the more you incorporate these behavior techniques, the more powerful it will become. Chapter 18. This final chapter talks about the 4 phases to focus on to become a master of all the techniques. These phases are visual, audio, response, and mental. The visual phase is about learning to observe behaviors. The audio phase is about learning to listen between the lines. The response phase is about taking the information you gained from the visual and audio phase and adapting your language to better connect with whoever you're speaking to. And the mental phase is about acquiring data and acting on it in real time. After that is a 25-week training plan. Each week focuses on spotting different things such as lip compression, where someone's feet are pointed, hygienic behavior, barrier behaviors, using elicitation, and so on. This 25-week training plan is designed to help the reader go from just having the knowledge to actually acquiring the skills necessary to read people. Some things to note about this book are that the author frequently stresses just how effective this system can be once practiced, and how important it is to not just know the system, but to actually apply the information and develop it into a real-life skill. It's also worth noting that there are also a few grammatical mistakes spread throughout the book, but nothing really major. So overall, I would say that this book's claim that this people reading system is deadly and that this book is groundbreaking is correct. But that's just my opinion. If you'd like to find out for yourself, check the description below this video where I've left a link to the book on Amazon.